court clinic referral for your consideration?
Thank you.
Your Honor.
So, counsel, you're requesting a referral to the court clinic. What is the purpose of the referral?
Parenting evaluation.
Full parenting evaluation of.
There's all kinds of research about what goes on in courts, criminal courts, juvenile court, family law courts, about the numbers of people of color who are, either defendants or in clients of the Department of Children and Families. There's all kinds of reasons for it that I won't go into that really don't affect the interpreters who will be coming in. The reasons aren't as important as knowing that you're going to be facing and dealing with people who are in fact sometimes look just like you. And it's very easy sometimes to get disillusioned and feel like everybody looks like this and everybody is bad or everybody's a defendant or whatever. And you have to remember and take a step back that that's not the majority of people. You also need to do some things to protect yourself from that. So you need to find outlets to reassure yourself that, yes, everybody I know who is a person of color, everybody who's deaf is not in court. Everybody's not facing DCF. There are hundreds of deaf people who raise their children and never see DCF. But what you're going to see is those deaf people who do. You're going to see the people of color who do. That's what you're going to see because that's who's here. So just knowing that and taking a step back. Recognizing it's important for interpreters and heritage signers and such to know that you are not that person. And so you are the interpreter. You are, a person of color, but you are not that person who was being judged, that person who's the defendant, the plaintiff, the client, the respondent. That's not you. Your job is to assist that person. And I think one thing that might be a little bit of a setback is you might not see too many people in positions of authority that look like you. And you might find yourself explaining who you are because people aren't used to seeing you. And that just comes with the territory. The world is changing. There was a time when you didn't see women judges, a time when you didn't see a lot of women lawyers. When I was in law school, my class of law students nationwide was the first time there was an equal number of men and women. Now it's tipped the other way and there's more women. So even going into the courts, there weren't a lot, you didn't see a lot of women. And we see it in every area of life, things are changing. And so you're part of that change as well. We don't see a lot of interpreters and heritage signers of color. We should, and hopefully we will. And your voice is important because, again, as you are the voice for someone and the voice for someone who looks like you can really do that voice justice, I think. And so it's very important that you participate and don't be discouraged by being the only one. If anything, recruit other people. When you see someone who is, has the potential, someone you've met and they can, whether it's a person who's, learning ASL or someone who's a CDI, somebody who's a native speaker, talk to that person, get them interested in the law. I think I took a fairly circuitous route to becoming an attorney. I did not start out to be an attorney. I began my career wanting to be a teacher of the deaf. I have a bachelor's of science in education of the deaf and sort of learned sign language sort of organically. I lived on the campus of the State School for the Deaf where my college was, so I was living with kids mostly, I'd say probably 60 to 70% of them were from families with deaf parents. So didn't really have any classes per se. I moved back home after graduating, decided I was going to teach, taught for 1 year in a public school program, ended up going to Washington, DC, hoping to teach at the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, never doing that and deciding to go to law school. And pretty much thought I had put, deaf education behind me, but I was in DC and I attended a church that had the oldest and largest deaf congregation. The deaf people were separate from the hearing people. They had their own minister, deacons, all the rest of that, and they taught me about interpreting. They threw me up there, they would criticize me, tell me when I was good, tell me when I was bad, and it was very Again, just a sort of organic, not classroom type thing with the real people. Graduated, came back to Massachusetts, thought again, the sign language was behind me, and I started working for a public agency, decided to strike out on my own, and decided I was interested in working in juvenile court. I started working in juvenile court, signed up to take court-appointed cases, and the very first client that I ever had was a deaf person. Because I had worked in, as a teacher of the deaf in a public school self-contained program, there was a lot of parents not fighting the IEP, not sure they wanted their kid in this class, they wanted their kids in, you know, something more like a state school for the deaf. And so it was the first time I saw lawyers doing something other than criminal law, and really started seeing, oh, there's a field of education law. So I thought that's what I would be studying. And so sort of all of those pieces of having a background in education, all of that plays into family law. You know, the ADA and Chapter 766, which is our special education law, all of that is juxtaposed to the law. And so because I had a familiarity with it already and an appreciation for, and actually a passion for those things, that led me to sort of focus my area of practice in those areas. Because, you know, even in you think it's a simple divorce case, and there's pieces to it. There's children with educational needs, which parent is going to be better suited to fit those. Just about every area of the law touches on the family, so it made a lot of sense for me, and it felt familiar. So what I see in the law is how it interacts with other parts of the law. So I don't believe that there's any case that is so wholly divorced from something else. I mean, there's all kinds of laws, and they all interact because it's all about people. Every legal case is about people. And so, you know, just like, say a case comes in it's a couple getting divorced. The judge in that case has to not just divide property, he also has to talk about who's best suited to be the full-time parent. Are these children suited to being half-time with each? Does one of the children have a special need? Do all of the children have special needs? Does one parent have mental health concerns? Does one parent have more earning capacity than the other? But it's all about the children and all about what's in their best interest. And what's in their best interest may not be what they want. And we take that into consideration in juvenile court because children, at least in Massachusetts, get appointed counsel. And counsel is required to, unless they're substituting their judgment, say for a baby or a very young child, to listen to what the child wants and give that information. I take that information into account. I may make a decision that's not what they want, and oftentimes as judges we have to do things that people don't want, but we want the advocates to tell us what people want, and then we take all the evidence, we look at it, and we decide what's in the best interest. That's always paramount in juvenile court, what's in the best interest of the child. So that's kind of how I see that the law intersects. There's just crazy intersections all the time. You might think you're on one road, but you're on another road. And it requires lawyers to kind of become little bits of experts in different areas. So if you have a case and you're representing someone who perhaps you don't speak their same language, it's sort of incumbent upon you to find a little bit about their culture, because maybe something is being perceived incorrectly, because that's just the way it is in their culture, and they don't realize how it's coming across. So lawyers and judges have to learn to get all the pieces of information that'll help make the right decision. Interpreters provide access to the court. They provide access to justice for that person that they are interpreting for. And we expect that the interpreters are not merely giving us a sort of word for word, this is what's being said. We expect that an interpreter is doing more than just translating something. They're actually communicating for this person. They're communicating the intent of what they're saying, the meaning behind it. And it's just important that we get all of that, because if someone gets on the stand and speaks for themselves, we hear them. We hear if they're angry, we hear the sarcasm in their voice, we hear it all. An interpreter has the responsibility of communicating all of that to us, because all of that goes into decisions that we make. You know, the sincerity of someone. They're, you know, particularly if there's a jury, they want to know what this person is. You know, they make decisions about what the person's thinking or what they're really saying. And an interpreter has all of that responsibility to be the actual voice of the person and to clearly communicate from the bench or from the attorneys the responsibilities of that individual. So I need to know if I give, in a case, I give custody to a parent, and the parent is a person who is speaking another language or is deaf, I want to know that when I say you're getting custody based on this, 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 and this, I want to know that the interpreter doesn't decide something I say isn't important and, you know, leaves it out. That can result in real serious consequences for the individual. So if I said to an interpreter, said to the parent, I will give you custody of this child. You will have custody on these following conditions. You must make sure the child goes to school every day on time. You must take the child for all doctor's appointments. You must, and I just have a whole laundry list. It's not sufficient for an interpreter to say, the children have to go to school, and because I said, you must make sure that child gets to school. The children, you know, to sort of summarize and abbreviate those conditions. Similarly, in a criminal case, if I allow someone liberty and say, but these are the conditions upon which you have your liberty, and then the interpreter leaves out something important. I mean, you know, yes, we give people paper with those written terms most times, but if the interpreter leaves that out, and then the person goes out and does exactly the opposite, even on one thing, they can be violated and held in custody. So it's not just that we hear from the person, and it's not just that, it's that we make sure the communication is actual and real and both parties understand what's being said. The challenges of practicing law are many. They're the challenges that everyone faces. When you're in private practice, it's running a business as well as practicing law. There are time challenges, there are family challenges, there are all sorts of challenges. As a person of color, there are challenges with perception. As a woman, there are challenges. Any challenge that you would face in just about any other field of practice or career, you will face as an attorney, you will face it as a judge. And you have to learn to have the confidence to know when you're wrong, look up what you need to look up, get help, ask for help in any field of law. You know, be professional, be on time, but if you don't know something, you got to find out what it is. And knowing when you're over your head, knowing when you need to maybe get some assistance from somebody. I'm not sure about this is way beyond me, in just about any endeavor, particularly in the law, because again, we're talking about people's life, their liberty, their children, primarily, their property. These are things that are very important, and you don't want to, you know, haphazardly do something. So the challenge is balancing all of that with being professional and your own life on top of it. For people who are concerned that the law is this foreign thing that they would never have any, you know, understanding of, that's for everybody. Nobody is born knowing anything. You know, I come into court in the morning and there's a cry, hear ye, hear ye. When was the last time you said hear ye, hear ye? Nobody does. Nobody talks that way. It is the language of the law, but you get used to it and you get comfortable with it. So I don't think that that should be any kind of obstacle in front of someone. The fact that you speak a different language, the fact that you're a native signer, the fact that English is your second, third, fourth language, none of that should be an obstacle, because Legalese is another language that we all had to learn. And even today, I'll hear a word that I'm not familiar with and I have to look it up. and make sure I understand it. And I think we all try to change, and as we're talking to people, not use those big words. But I would say understanding legalese absolutely is not an obstacle. You can learn it, you'll become familiar with it. And remember, the judge, the lawyer, the clerk, none of us knew it before we started working here. We learn it. And so it's just another thing you have to learn. That would be my, my sort of, it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. I believe that the protocols and such of different courts are going to be different everywhere you go. So in Massachusetts, juvenile courts are closed. We have, I believe, one of the best systems. Our clients, our litigants get attorneys, the parents get attorneys. That's not the case in a lot of places, and that can be a problem for someone who's, sort of mediating in a sense, or operating as a voice of someone asking you questions because they don't have a lawyer. That doesn't happen a whole lot in Massachusetts, particularly in juvenile. Our sessions are closed, they are confidential. The only time that sessions are open are when someone is being tried as a youthful offender, sort of akin to being tried as an adult in other jurisdictions. Family law, disability law, I just think the thing to remember is this, that you are working for a person, and it is that person's access. That's really the main thing, and I don't think it's particularly different court to court. I think that your most important person is that person who is seeking justice, and just remember that. It's not so much about the trappings of the courtroom or what they call something. It doesn't really, if it's called this in one court and something else in another and something else in another, or even within the state, county to county, they do it a little differently. Bottom line at the end of the day is you want that person to have their access to justice. So the intersection of family law, juvenile law, and domestic violence law, the common denominator is the person, either the person who is accused of the batterer, alleged batterer, the victim, the children who either have experienced it by seeing it, hearing it, being in the midst of it, being a victim of it. It's all about a family. It's all about the dynamic in the family. It's all about how people interact. With respect to interpreters, one thing that people should be aware of, there's a shortage of interpreters. And so oftentimes when you have a case, there's one interpreter. And that interpreter, maybe when there's a restraining order case, is going to interpret for two people. And we set it up so that one person's on one side and one person's on the other side, and we keep them separate. But that interpreter is voicing, in many cases, for both people. And that's a difficult thing to do. I know that some people do it very well, and some people don't do it as well. It's up to the attorney if they feel that it's problematic to speak up and do something about it. I can remember having an incident, not with an ASL interpreter, but the interpreter, I represented the alleged batterer. And I would hear my client say what he said in his language, and then I would hear it come out the mouth of the interpreter, and it just didn't sound the same. It sounded mean. It sounded, and I know that, and I knew that interpreter, and I knew her well, and I understood it. But she's standing next to a woman who has bruises all over her. I'm the lawyer for the person who is allegedly the batterer. I know how he was speaking. He was speaking meekly and calmly and quietly. He also had bruises on him. And so, I had to speak up and say, I think I want this hearing on another day when we can have our own interpreter, because I was concerned about how he was coming across. That's not always possible, and it's also not always possible to do it quickly. And so I think interpreters have to really be cognizant of that. And sometimes if they're interpreting for a child who might say, no, it didn't happen, and the interpreter's looking and knowing that, in fact, most likely it did, their responsibility is still to interpret what's being said. So there's a lot of dynamics that go on in that situation that you just have to be aware of and make sure you can handle. If you're going to interpret for two or more people because you have to, remember what you're doing and not aligning your side with one side or the other. Remembering not to exchange information that might be given. It's a tough job, but sometimes it has to be done for justice to be accomplished quickly and expeditiously as it should be. So one thing I think interpreters need to remember in their role as officers of the court, they take an oath. Their obligation is to the court. Their obligation is to communicate the information to the court and to not take shortcuts, not to side with one side or the other. And as I think I said earlier, sometimes that's hard. There are other times when you are interpreting for that client, and that attorney has gone out and has hired you specifically, and you're not an officer of the court. You're a working part of that defense or prosecution team. That's very different. A court interpreter is giving the information and relaying information from the court. They're an officer of the court. They have an obligation not to take sides and just to be impartial and just to communicate impartially. As an attorney, I have represented deaf people in everything from buying a house, starting a business, selling a business, employment law discrimination, and criminal cases, run the gamut from OUIs, larceny. I've also represented deaf people as plaintiffs, suing civilly a business or a contractor or something like that. I've also represented lots of deaf people in care and protection cases, which are state intervention and child custody cases in Massachusetts. I would say it's run the gamut. Deaf people need lawyers just like everybody else needs lawyers. So when people find that there is an attorney who can speak their language, they tend to go to that person for everything. And sometimes if it was not in my, what they say, wheelhouse, I would have to send the person to someone else. And certainly, a divorce, I can't represent both parties, so have to refer the other deaf person out to someone who maybe couldn't sign, but someone who was good, that I knew. As a judge, I'm in juvenile court now, so the cases I see are civil and criminal. I haven't really interacted with many deaf juveniles, except on the care and protection side. On the civil side, I've had deaf parents, a lot of deaf parents. In our court in Massachusetts, we provide an interpreter, even when the child's on a charge of a delinquency. It doesn't matter. The parent is entitled to an interpreter so that they know what's going on. So I've had that experience where the child is fine, is telling us, yeah, my parent doesn't need to know. It's like, yes, they do, and we're going to make sure they do. We get that interpreter in there for them. So that's pretty much been most of my experiences as a judge. As a bilingual attorney, I would say, and I have friends who are bilingual. I know at least one other person who signs Spanish, Portuguese. You've got a job to do, and when you're doing your job, it's one thing to sit in a room and chat with someone one-on-one and have a conversation with them. It's a whole another thing to be their lawyer, to be advocating in a situation. And for myself, I did not find it appropriate for me to try to do two jobs at once. I find an interpreter's job is very different than the lawyer's job. So for me to chat with my client is great. For me to represent my client and for my client to know everything that's going on in that courtroom, that I need an interpreter. If the subject matter was such that it was something that I wasn't particularly familiar with or was very difficult, I might have an interpreter with me, even if it was just a one-on-one client meeting. I wasn't trained as a legal interpreter. I wasn't trained as an interpreter at all, except from the people that at the church that I was at. So my skills, whatever they are, were for me to have personal one-on-one conversations. And most of the interpreters I worked with respected that, and I could chat away with my client, and then it was time to get down to work, was time for the interpreter to do their job and make sure I understood everything my client was saying and that my client understood. Occasionally you have a client who says, well, you know, I don't want the interpreter here, and I can respect that. And that was fine, but not in the courtroom. They had to have the interpreter in the courtroom. And I think most of my, my fellow attorneys when I was practicing who spoke other languages felt pretty much the same way. You know, we can chat, we can talk, we can conference, we can do all these things, but when it comes down to everybody doing a job, the interpreter has a separate and distinct job to do than the attorney, and the attorney can't be distracted by trying to explain something or telling them that, hey, there's a commotion going on in the hallway, which they have a right to know. I don't care if I'm practicing law. The interpreter tells everybody what's going on. So I just think that's a really important distinction. But it's great to have someone who speaks your own language on some level. But there's something about when you're representing a black male or a Latino male or a white male. It would be nice to have a male voice coming out of when they're testifying. I can remember maybe one or two scenarios where I think an interpreter of color would have been better with someone who used a lot of slang, and it wasn't, and the interpreter that I had was, we really need CDI, and I thought, he's not really. He didn't think he did. She just wasn't comfortable. It was more the interpreter wasn't comfortable. And, I watched my client kind of start changing his language and changing his, code switching to the point that he started being very stilted and, C almost. And it was fine for me. I got what I wanted, but I could see in that situation a male would have been, just any male would have been better. Certainly a male of color, certainly someone who was more personality-wise like this guy, whose personality and use of language did not translate. I think for this interpreter it translated to language deficient, and I didn't think this person. I didn't see him as language deficient or English deficient, or I didn't see that in him. I just saw a personality, and I know people who would have interpreted for him just fine. So yeah, there are always times. I mean, there are times when you wish somebody had a black lawyer or a Latino lawyer or whatever. So it's not surprising, and I hope that more people of color become interpreters for just that reason. And it's not just to interpret for, black people for the black people. That's not what I'm talking about either. I think it's really important that we're there everywhere, because we're everywhere in life. And so why not be in the courtroom interpreting? I would hope that people who were coming into the field of legal interpreting, court interpreting, had just experience in life, had been to places, had seen things, had done things. I think, traveling is great. Anything that exposes you to another culture and another way of thinking, another way of saying something, new expressions, all of that is really important when communicating with the court. And I think back to a case where it was a spoken language interpreter. It was when I was an attorney, and the interpreter, my client was seen as this sort of mentally ill, crazy person. It was a child care and protection case, and she kept using a phrase that, I won't repeat the phrase, but it kind of didn't make sense. She was talking about her marriage, and she was using these words that I didn't understand. They were English, but I all right, so do you know what he said to me? He said our marriage was X. And I thought, well, how bad is that? I heard from the interpreter just how bad it was, that it meant it was a sham, that it meant that you would not have put those 4 words together and come up with this. But the interpreter was from that country. He understood what that meant and took me aside and said, what she's saying is, and I was like, oh my goodness. It was sort of like, think of the foulest thing you could say to your spouse. That's what it was. It didn't sound like that. And so that knowledge of the way people talk in this country, that knowledge of if I heard, and knowing that I would never know that from those words. So it's not just the language of the country, of the culture. It's also knowing that it doesn't really translate in English, and no one's ever going to know what you mean by that unless I tell you something. Just really knowing how language works, and not in a textbook way, but in a way of, I heard somebody say this, what does that mean? Exploring those types of things, and just being able to translate that into the courtroom, bringing all of that experience is just really, really important. And some of it you already have. It's not like you have to go out and get it. It's the fact that you grew up. Generally, people of color are bicultural. You have to be in the mainstream. You have to know all about George Washington and all of that stuff that all of us Americans have to know. But you also have to know your own family history. You have to know the stuff they don't teach you in books. That's what you get in your family. And bringing that into the courtroom is essential. It's essential to the judge, the lawyers understanding who is before them. And so every experience that you've had, every experience you've had in school, remembering that that is all a part of it. It's not just the book and the ASL and putting my perfect inflection or my perfect, using the right classifier. That's not all it is. It's really being able to communicate who the whole person is, and you bring that with you. So everything that you've done in life, everything you've gone through, all of your issues, your problems, all of that experience is something that translates and is useful as an interpreter. And I hope people recognize that it's not having gone to the right school for 5 years, studied, gotten an A in ASL 1, 2, 3, 4, ASL linguistics and all. That's all great, but that's all on top of what you already bring to the table. And when you put those together, so you now have the technical and all the other stuff that supports the technical, that's what we need in the courtroom. We need the whole package. The one thing I say to people is you have to take your job very seriously. So your role as an interpreter is a very serious role, but you don't have to take yourself too seriously. You have to take the job seriously, but not yourself. And you always have to remember that the most important person in that courtroom is the person who is either fighting for their child, fighting for their life, fighting for their liberty. It's not you, it's not the judge, it's not the clerk. Everybody's got a role to do. Everybody's got a role in making sure that the right decision gets made. And once you recognize that, what I think you can do to increase that is to just really try to understand why we're here. So understand what goes on in family court, understand what goes on in juvenile court, understand the type of cases that you will be listening to, the types of cases that you will be interpreting for. What's the judge listening for? Find out if you can just go and listen to a case and hear the kind of questions the judge asks, or hear what the lawyer is asking. Just courtrooms are open with the exception of juvenile in Massachusetts. I don't know about other places. So just try to find out what it's about. And from a very sort of I just want to know what's going on in here. Who's moving where, what are they doing? When I first went in to do criminal cases, I just sat in the back of the courtroom, and it wasn't so much to increase my legal knowledge, it was to increase my comfort in that environment. So sit in the back and so that's the person that calls the case out. And then what happens after that? Oh, this person gets up. People stand when they speak. Some communities, people don't stand. In some courts, some states, that's not customary. In Massachusetts, it is customary to stand when you address the court. What does the court do? What does someone do if they don't have a lawyer? How does that work? What's going on? Just getting familiar in the building, everything about the building is helpful when you're learning to work in the building. And as an interpreter, you would be working in the building. Who do you ask when a fight breaks out? What happens? Who is it that tells you where something is? Where do you get the information? What goes on in the clerk's office? All of that, that's when you feel comfortable. You're not really worried about looking up, what's the Black's Law Dictionary definition of complaint. That doesn't matter. You're going to see a real living complaint. What does the court do when someone has no lawyer? What does the court do when someone does have a lawyer? What does the court do when it finds out too late someone doesn't speak English? What are people given? What types of paper? All of that, make yourself comfortable. You can watch a little Law and Order, but that's not real. Just getting familiar with language and all the rest of it. But I think being familiar with what goes on where you're going to be is really important and will make you feel better about being an interpreter. You will hear something so often that you'll be able to do it. And then that comfort is relayed because that's another thing you put out of your mind. I don't have to, when I walk in, I don't have to remember, oh, I'm going to walk in and they're going to say all rise and then they're going to say you can be, that just happens. But it happened a bunch of times. It scared me the first time when I came in and they said all rise. So just getting yourself familiar as much as you can, I think is probably going to be the biggest benefit of going into a court and interpreting. What I'm saying is important is to bring others along. When you see other people who have the skills or could have the skills, whether that's someone who is a native signer or someone who's learning ASL or learning to speak another language, I just encourage you to bring that person along, encourage them to get interested. That's how we make the change. It doesn't change any other way.